What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content that I'm uploading onto my channel, then feel free to subscribe, and you can also offer suggestions on topics and characters and storylines and whatnot that we can have discussions on later on in this channel.
Hells bells, man. So now that I'm finally starting to get over this cold that I've had for the last week, we can finally start getting back into my schedule again. Thank goodness. This cold has been absolutely killing me. And of course, we pick up with this with Exomana War. Now, the cool thing about this is that when it comes to comic books are like music, right? I mean, let's say that you fire up a track by like Calvin Harris or something like that, something that's like EDM, all right? If you guys ever wondered how DJs DJ, it's beat matching. You can literally fire up a Calvin Harris song, and when the first beat starts, you could say 1, 2, 3, 4, and do that all the way up to when you get to 8, 2, 3, 4, and then either it'll repeat or it'll change. You can set your watch to it. I used to DJ. You can set your watch to it. That's how it works. Everything's like that. Maybe it'll start to get into the crescendo and all that kind of good stuff. Comics are the exact same way. Comics have eras, they have stories, they have, progression. And that's what Exomana War did. And that's one of the reasons why Valiant Comics are so cool, is because with Marvel and DC, it's a give and take. It's one of these things where you just kind of accept that's how it goes. Sometimes they deviate, but with Valiant, they kind of grab the best of Marvel and DC with regards to how they tell their stories, and they sort of go back to basics. It's really a very, ground level, boots to the ground sort of storytelling. And what I mean by that is we can follow it in a very easy to understand way. That's why it's always so easy to pick up Valiant Comics. It's always so easy to just kind of jump into it, because you can go online, read a Wikipedia article, and then immediately be able to grab the story. It's not like Superior Spider-Man, where you have to go and you have to read, 20 trades in order to understand what happened before Superior Spider-Man. You can just jump right into it. And so the cool thing here is that we pick up with the next era of Exomana War. Of course, remember, everything up to this point, which you'll find the playlist down in the description, everything up to this point dealt with the origin story, essentially, of Eric of Dacia. This guy who was basically stripped from his homeland in, the Roman era of Earth's history, thrown aboard a Vine mothership, forced to work as a slave, and then eventually gained his freedom by way of securing the armor of Shanhara, destroying the entirety of the Vine fleet, and then, basically saving his people and arriving back on Earth, finding that 2,000 years had basically passed. And so what this does is it basically takes the next step in saying that with the Vine essentially defeated, where does Eric go from here? Well, the most logical step is to form a kingdom for himself, because he sees himself as the rightful heir of the Visigoth. I mean, that's the cool thing about this, is because technically speaking, just in terms of the line of succession, he's the nephew of the king, or at least the king of Visigoth at the time when he was initially kidnapped. And so because of this, he is the rightful ruler, but he doesn't have a territory. He doesn't have a land. Visigoth doesn't exist anymore. It's now Romania. 2,000 years ago, it was Visigoth, but the world's changed so much over the course of the last several millennia that nothing is like it used to be. And this is the cool thing here, is because this really hits home at the idea that Eric is a man out of time. I mean, this is, Earth as it exists now is not his home. He might as well be on the other side of the universe. He might as well be in another dimension because of how far things have changed. But in his mind, it doesn't matter. Now, of course, the fact that he's arriving back on Earth in this Vine ship along with the other members of the Visigoths who were rescued in his attempts to basically cast off the Vine race draws the attention of everybody. I mean, all eyes are on him, because remember, this takes place in the modern day, which means you have satellites orbiting the planet Earth, and an alien ship landing on Earth will be noticed. And that's the cool thing here, is because when we look at like Marvel or DC or something like that, like an alien will crash land on Earth or something along those lines, and we may or may not hear about some government agency looking into it. S.H.I.E.L.D. may or may not have anything to do with the story. We're just kind of left to assume that maybe they know about it, maybe they don't. The cool thing about Valiant is they keep their titles really, really small. They keep them, under a dozen publications, really around like 8 or so. And because of that, what it does is it allows them to kind of focus on these little nuances, these little specifics that make the story more cohesive. And that's what's so cool about this, is because it's literally the US government looking at this and saying, we have an alien ship that's entering the planet Earth. Their initial response is, if it comes here, then we respond accordingly. If it doesn't, we wait and see what happens. And that's exactly what takes place. It basically ends up hovering over Romania, over the territory of what used to be, or at least what's supposed to be Dacia. Now, the cool thing about this is that with regards to the legacy of Exomana War of Eric, Dacia is kind of like this promised promised land. It's the land they hailed from and the land that they'll return to once again. Now, of course, we'll find out a little bit more in terms of why they, why they lost that territory in the first place. But really, upon landing here, he brings the people out and says, this is now your land. This is where we will live. This is where we will reside. And that's what's so ironic about this. It's because he's just doing it. He's just showing up in a country that already exists, and it's just like, I claim this land in the name of Dacia, and our initial response would be, well, you can't do that. Well, that's exactly how things play out. Now, of course, the other thing to keep in mind here is that Exomana War is very much the face of Valiant Comics in a lot of ways. Like Spider-Man is the face of Marvel Comics, Superman is the face of DC, Exomana War is the face of Valiant. And the idea here is that because Exomana War was really the first major publication, it was kind of like the title that Valiant used to kind of relaunch itself in 2012, all eyes were on this publication. And so it made perfect sense for Valiant to come along and say, all these different publications that we're going to branch out from, with the rest of the Valiant line are going to originate with Exomana War. The characters will pop up there. And of course, we see that a lot in comic books. It's always been that way. With Marvel Comics back in the 1960s, it was the Fantastic Four. If you were going to introduce a new team into Marvel Comics or a new character, you introduce them in the Fantastic Four because that's the title everybody was reading. With Superman, it was much the same way. Eventually it became the Justice League, and then it was the Teen Titans in the 1980s because the Teen Titans under Marv Wolfman was the most popular title in comic books at the time, even outselling X-Men, I think. And the idea is that with Exomana War, this is the title that everybody was reading when Valiant was relaunching in 2012, 2013, 2014. And so the idea was that if they were going to start introducing characters, they would do it through this. Now, keep in mind, it wasn't like this was brand new to the world. Valiant was basing this off previously existing characters, but updating them for modern sensibilities. And so one of the first characters that we see outside of Ninjak in the last videos that we had gone over is Gilad, basically the Eternal Warrior. And that's the coolest thing about this. Now, with regards to Eternal Warrior, he kind of has an origin, but kind of doesn't. But what Valiant's doing is in May, they're releasing a story called The Awakening, I think it is. And it's a one-shot, a 48-page one-shot, but it's basically going to cover the origin stories of Eternal Warrior, of Ivar the Time Walker, and of Armstrong. And of course, the three immortal brothers of the Valiant universe. But it's basically going to go over their origin in detail, if I understand that correctly. I could be wrong, but the solicitations, I think, are indicating that's going to be the case. So that'll be like the one-shot tried and true origin. How that's going to tie in to the rest of the publications that Valiant has on, Archer and Armstrong and Eternal Warrior and Ivar the Time Walker, I'm not sure, but Valiant's usually tighten it. I mean, they play it close to the vest when it comes to continuity. That's like a huge part of their whole thing. Continuity is a must, and so it'll probably segue in pretty perfectly. It'll fit in just like it's supposed to. But all we really need to know for the sake of this story is that Eternal Warrior lives up to his namesake. He's literally a guy that has existed for millennia, really, and he'll continue to exist probably until the end of all things. And because of this, he is, for all intents and purposes, the greatest warrior. He's incredible in terms of his fighting prowess. He's got enhanced strength, different things like that. But it also really kind of points home to the notion of Valiant Comics in the sense that Valiant is very real world-like. I mean, of course, the world outside your windows, they're very real world-like. So you're not going to find a character in Valiant Comics with like the Hulk strength, right? Where it's like unlimited strength. The angrier he gets, the stronger he gets. It's very much like, what would these people be like if they existed in the real world? And so it's really strength greater than that of a normal man, but only insofar that it keeps it within the realm of being reasonable. So that's really what goes on here with Eternal Warrior, enhanced strength, durability, basically a healing factor. It's really cool to see a lot of these things kind of come together. But even then, in a lot of ways, this character's somewhat of an enigma. But what we find out here is that Eternal Warrior, as the character Gilad, had basically been the mentor of Eric in his younger days. And it made perfect sense because as a man that's been fighting wars, that has been immersed in conflict for thousands of years, there's no better person to have as a teacher. He would teach you everything you need to know and probably make you one of the greatest fighters to have ever existed. And it also made sense that he would be the trainer for someone that would carry on the royal line of the Visigoths. And so the idea here is that Eternal Warrior shows up and says, look, you've kept my counsel, or your family kept my counsel for quite some time. Allow me to counsel you here. You can't just show up in this territory and claim it as your kingdom. It doesn't work that way anymore. This isn't 2,000 years ago. It's not like to the victor go the spoils. It's not an age where whoever it is that can defend themselves wins and whoever can't is conquered, and that's the end of that. There's treaties, there's globalization, there's all different kinds of things here. There's nuclear weapons. The world doesn't exist the way that you think it does. And that's the coolest thing, is because Eric still hasn't caught on to everything that's going on. And that's the point that Eternal Warrior makes here, right? I mean, Eric basically says, no, for ever and ever and ever, my people had always struggled struggle. My people would always suffer. They were basically tricked by the Romans. They were told by the Romans, come join our side and the world will be a better place. You'll have everything you need, so on and so forth, and then they were just kind of left to their own devices and eventually turned on by the Romans. Time and time again, the Visigoths always had to struggle. Eric looks at this as the idea that my race or my people can finally have peace. They can finally have their promised land. But Eternal Warrior's response is, but it doesn't work that way. You can't just show up in somebody's backyard and say, this land belongs to me. Not only that, you fail to understand the gravity of the situation. Armies will roll in here with tanks and they will kill everyone. And that's really the lesson that Eternal Warrior is setting here, because basically what he's saying is, look, I understand that you want your people to have a kingdom. I understand that you want your people to have a place, but of what use is a kingdom to a king whose people are dead? You're the king of a kingdom with no one in it. You serve no purpose, a one-man king. And so it creates kind of this interesting situation, because at the end of the day, Eric still doesn't listen. He still doesn't care. In his mind, he's blinded by ambition. But it's also this idea that he never really grew up. He never really began to understand wisdom. Now, the cool thing about this is that this is also Valiant basically telling us, hey, look, at the end of the day, Eternal Warrior's nobody to scoff at. And we know that, right? I mean, we know Eternal Warrior is like a wrecking machine. This dude's a one-man army. Like, we know Eternal Warrior is an absolute monster when it comes to just taking people on. All his different abilities, make him a formidable threat, in conjunction with the fact that he's been fighting for so long. But he also tells Eric, look, man, like you're basically a child. You're throwing a temper tantrum, you're jumping up and down, you're stomping your feet. You want things to be your way. You have to learn that it's not the case. Now, the cool thing is that, again, Eternal Warrior is here more as a counselor, more as a piece of advice than someone who truly wants to engage in a fight. Now, of course, a fight does take place between the two, really, if for no other reason than Valiant's just kind of like, hey guys, here's a fight you want to see. Eternal Warrior and Exomana War. And it plays out pretty well. I mean, it plays out pretty cool. I mean, you have a guy who has fighting experience versus a guy who has this enhanced suit that allows him to do all kinds of different things. And of course, Exomana War gets the upper hand on Eternal Warrior. And this is really just kind of Valiant telling us, here's where Exo stands in the hierarchy of people with abilities. He's really just kind of up at the top right now with the suit granting him powers. But it's also this idea that, much like Tony Stark, that Exo is only as powerful as the suit allows him to be. Without it, he's just a guy with whatever training he remembers from when he existed during the Roman era. And so again, it creates this really, really cool circumstance, the keys to success, that kind of thing. But again, with Eternal Warrior basically saying, okay, fine, if this is how it's going to be, then I'll let you do your own thing, but understand everything that comes next is on your head. What the story does is it transitions to Eric alongside Sana. Now remember, I guess Sana or Sana is one of the women that reminds him of his former wife Deidre. And of course, one of the things that Eternal Warrior had told Eric was that, when Eric asked what happened to my wife, it was really that her freedom was secured. She was allowed to go, back to whatever life she had, but she'd have spent years waiting for Eric to come back and eventually just kind of died of old age. And that was it. She just more or less perished as we kind of expected her to. But what this does, what Sana does is really kind of represent this idea of happiness for Eric. This chance for him to sort of pick back up where he left off. And again, that's the biggest issue here is for him, he doesn't see it as though 2,000 years have passed. He sees it as though it's just yesterday. He sees it as though he left and he's trying to basically regain everything he lost. And that's the coolest thing about this, is because it's really kind of a reflection of us as people, right? I mean, let's say that like you're 11 years old and your parents split and you're moved to a different location. If your entire life experiences this huge upheaval, you want to go back to the way things used to be, and you'll do what you can, kicking and screaming. And if you have the opportunity to go back to the way it was, you'll pursue that. The problem is you'll eventually learn that what you're nostalgic for is the idea of how things used to be, not the way they actually were. And so that's exactly the way it is here with Eric of Dacia. It's really this idea that he's nostalgic for the life he lived. He's nostalgic for the era of battle. He's nostalgic for storming the fields against armies and finding honor and death. But the world doesn't exist that way anymore. It's all about, it's the digital age, it's treaties, it's, everybody's got their finger on the nuclear button, so nobody ever presses it. Nobody ever really engages in these huge, grandiose battles anymore. It's guerrilla warfare tactics everywhere. And so because of that, he's really just he's in a situation that he can't really handle. And so what this does is this transitions over to Alexander Dorian. Now keep in mind, Alexander Dorian was one of these plantlings. And this is something that I kind of want, or I guess plantings, but this is something that I want to run over real quick. For those of you guys who are just joining us here, when the Vine first showed up on Earth and they began kidnapping humans, taking them aboard their mothership and using them as slaves, what the Vine did is they traveled around other planets throughout the entirety of existence. planets. And what they would do is they would leave plantings behind, basically vine duplicates of humans. And what would happen is they would grow up on that planet and they would basically just be a way for the vine to leave their legacy behind. Now, it would also allow the vine to basically expand their rule and to always watch and to always monitor these other planets. They wouldn't necessarily go back and conquer them later on, but if a planet managed to evolve technology in such a fashion that they were either, that their technology would either be beneficial to the vine or a threat to the vine, then that technology would be absorbed by way of the vine going through using their plantings to essentially take that planet over or to eliminate it in its entirety or something along those lines. But again, it was really kind of an interesting situation, but Alexander Dorian's role here is again very much to be a liaison, and that's really kind of the way things work. He's basically an ambassador from the United States, or I guess on behalf of the United States for Eric. But the other half of this is Eric basically tells his people, let's begin growing crops, let's begin seeding things, let's begin, growing wheat and so on and so forth. And that's why I say he's so far removed from reality, because the funny thing about this is a couple members of his group, really a guy, led by a guy named Volo, they essentially just kind of bail out. They just kind of take off. And what they end up doing is they end up finding a market. And inside this market is fruit, vegetables, grain, bread, all kinds of things, everything they need. And it's actually kind of funny because what they end up doing is they end up grabbing a whole bunch of guys, running back and ransacking the grocery store. Which is kind of funny. I mean, I can imagine that. I can imagine people who believe or who have somehow been time displaced from 2,000 years ago running into a grocery store and just snatching everything up. It's kind of funny to me. It's just kind of an interesting thing to me. But of course, picking up with the arrival of Alexander Dorian, what he does is he tells Eric, look, the world is watching you right now. Your arrival here in Romania has not gone unnoticed. Even the country of Romania itself is terrified of what you're doing, but you're also meddling around in what used to be Soviet territory, which means that like the Russian Spetsnaz is going to come looking for a way to basically take you out, to remove you, because the armor you have represents a credible threat to their rule. And that's one of the other interesting things here is Valiant plays a very real world in terms of how their characters exist. And so Exomana War taking up residence in Romania presents a credible threat for a couple reasons. One, because it's basically just occupying a territory. It's going into a country and effectively invading it. But the other half is that the armor he possesses is wildly powerful. And so the governments of the world would covet that armor. They would seek to attain it for themselves. And those who cannot gain it through, working alongside Eric will try to gain it through force. And that's exactly what the Russians basically do. And that's what Alexander Dorian says. The Russians will come looking for you, but the United States is offering you clemency. Now, Eric's response to this is that he is, Eric of Dacia, not Eric of America. But the funny thing about this is that he's basically working against, or he's really declining the offer of Alexander Dorian for two reasons. The second, which he doesn't know about. Of course, the first one being, again, because he wants to stay in Romania, the land that used to be, Dacia in his mind. But also, what he doesn't realize is that if he were to travel to the United States, they would try to weaponize the Exo armor. They would say, look, we offered you clemency here. You have to give something back. You can't just, be here. We can kick you out at any point in time. If you really want your people to thrive here in America, you need to help us help you. That's exactly how it would work. It would really just be blackmail. That's the way it would play out. Now, it's not like Alexander would foresee this. I mean, he probably would, but it's not like it's his intention to dupe Exo. In truth, he's his ally. He's the one that helped Exo, fend off against the Vine invasion when they initially showed up on Earth. And then, of course, basically awaited Exo's return when he took off to the planet of Loam and obliterated what was left of the Vine military, allowing the priests to take over. And so, what he basically says is, look, man, you have to look out for your people. You have to, if you're a king, you have to keep the benefit of your people in mind. And if you're going to do that, then you have to do it in a way that ensures that everybody comes out of this safely. And again, it's really Alexander Dorian making the exact same case that Eternal Warrior was making and saying, hey, look, man, this is an age of warfare. All right, this is an age of nuclear weapons. You think that your armor would keep your people safe. All somebody has to do, all the Russians have to do is press a button, and everywhere in a 15 square mile radius, not even that, maybe everywhere in, in a 100 square mile radius of where you're at right now is dead. It will cease to exist. You will be gone. You will see a flash of light, and then that will be it. And it's crazy here because Eric still doesn't grasp how dangerous his situation is. And so, of course, the situation plays out exactly the way that we would expect it to. Of course, with the Russian Spetsnaz kidnapping a handful of his people, kidnapping one of his people, going through and experimenting on them, what this does is it basically creates this scenario where they begin to discover the fact that these individuals that are here, that are, alongside Eric, are not alien, that they're human. Now, the Russians don't quite know why. I mean, they don't know anything about the fact that the Vine Vine had kidnapped, humans in the early days of Earth and whisked them off to the other side of the universe. But the military, the Spetsnaz agents look at this, really the lieutenant, the head of this, looks at that and says, if it's human, it means it can be killed like humans, which means we can eliminate them. Now, again, the idea of the Russians is to basically secure the Exo armor for themselves. That's really the goal, is to take out Eric, to take out his people, and secure the Exo armor to use Eric's people against them. But what ends up happening is Eric actually runs into a little bit of a challenge from his guy Volo. And that's really what always happens here, because keep in mind, the people that Eric has brought here are the ones who had been stowed away on the homeworld of the Vine on Loam. And so Eric didn't know that they were alive until he went to Loam, to their actual homeworld. And so because of this, these individuals had managed to survive and thrive on their own, but their existence was really kept along by the efforts of Volo, who kept them organized, who kept them looking for a brighter day. And so really, he saw himself as leader of what was left of the Visigoth and the various members of the world who had been taken prisoner by the Vine on the Vine homeworld. But then suddenly Eric shows up with his Exo armor, liberates them all, and says, now I am your king. Now I am the one who's running the show. Of course, it's going to create some rivalry between himself and Volo. And so, of course, what ends up happening here is the Russians launch a missile, and of course, the Exomana War immediately tells, Exo, hey, look, there's a missile coming here. Exo takes off. But we end up learning this is a distraction, and it's actually a really, really intelligent distraction. The goal of the Russians was to fire a missile into the air in order to drag Exo away, in order to keep his people safe. Of course, with the missile being a dud, he detects the submarine where the missile came from and attacks the submarine. But what this does is it seems to leave his people totally unguarded. Now, of course, his folks are anything but unguarded. Of course, they go back into the ship, they grab some of the weapon constructs of the Vine, and of course, they hold their own. But what this does is it creates a tough situation for Exo, and the reason being because when he gets back and those different members of the Spetsnaz are taken out, after Exo had destroyed the submarine, killing everybody on board, when he gets back, he's basically faced with Volo saying, look, you left us unguarded. You almost allowed us to be killed. If it wasn't for me and my quick thinking, all of us would have been killed. You're not fit to be king. What kind of king abandons his people to their fate? And so again, it creates this really wild situation because what it's doing is setting the seeds for a insurrection against Eric by virtue of Volo, trying to cast him off as leader. And so as the story begins to wrap up, what we do is we basically pick up with the early formings of Unity. Of course, basically a group that's kind of spearheaded by Toyo Harada, the guy who was head of the Harbinger Foundation, all that kind of good stuff. But it's setting the seeds and basically saying that because Exomana War's suit is so powerful, because his suit is so capable, that the armies of the world don't stand a chance, aside from using nuclear weapons, and basically sending the world into a state of nuclear winter, killing everything on Earth. Even then, not being able to guarantee the armor would be destroyed. The only option they have is to basically grab superpowered individuals from across the world and pit them all against Exomana War in an attempt to take him out. So it's really going to be Exomana War versus the world. Really, Exomana War against Toyo Harada, I think. And it's going to be a really, really cool story the way it all plays out. But with that being said, guys, if you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.